So going back just briefly to your school days, you had happy years at Sydney Grammar?
Yes.
And anything in particular or any masters you recall affectionately?
Well, there were two masters I recall who I think did have an influence on me. One was a history master. He was also an economics teacher, the man called Cheesehead Bonwick, who was an Englishman, and by occupation actually a mining engineer, but he ended up as a schoolmaster. And I thought he was a very impressive man. And the other one was an English master, Alan Sams, who had actually started at the bar but didn't succeed, and then, because tough going in those days, the Depression years, starting at the bar, and then became a schoolmaster. He taught first at Shaw and then later at Sydney Grammar School. And one of his pupils at Shaw was a man called John Evans, who became a QC or KC, I think it was in those days. No, a QC then, and was the lecturer in contracts. Is it contracts? No, not contracts. Could have been contract. Commercial law, lecturer in commercial law at Sydney University, who I got to know, and I was initially introduced to him by Alan Sams.
Right. I'm looking at a photo of you here taken at the age of 18 when you joined the Air Force. Now, you actually look quite a bit younger than 18. And
I thought you were going to say, look younger than I do now.
Well, you always do. But you do. You look. I'm looking at you and you're very fresh faced then. And, of course, the war had begun. And I imagine, well, what were your emotions at that time, on the day that photo was taken? You look as though, for all the world, there was your life ahead of you, everything that was going to happen. You didn't imagine the horrors of war.
I would then have been stationed at Bradfield, which was the initial training school in the Air Force in Sydney. And I think that probably was taken very shortly after I joined the Air Force.
By then, did you meet Tom Hughes? His father was very much involved in the training of the Air Force.
I'd known Tom Hughes much earlier, of course, when we were schoolboys. But Tom was older than I was. I've forgotten by just how much, probably 18 months, something like that. And therefore he was well ahead of me in the Air Force. And probably at that time he would have been in Europe, in England, flying Sunderlands.
By contrast, what were you doing in those years?
Well, I was at school and still at school and doing first year arts at the university.
There would have been a paucity of lecturers at that time, I would imagine.
Yes, indeed there was a paucity of schoolmasters. I remember a number of the masters who taught me at Sydney Grammar in 1941-42 were retired schoolmasters who had come out of retirement in order to teach again.
I know that some I've interviewed at that time felt that impacted adversely in the quality of their education, but there was nothing that could be done. It was wartime and you did what you could.
Yes, I don't know whether it impacted on the quality of education. I suppose logic would tell you that it probably did, but I think it's very difficult to quantify.
So what were your hopes, when that photo was taken, what were your hopes for the next few years, not knowing how long the war was going to last, what was going to happen here in Australia, let alone in the rest of the world?
I don't know that I had any long-term aspirations, except that when the war ended, I wanted to study law. Actually, my object in studying law, I think, betrayed a misconception of what law was about. I thought that next to mathematics, law would be the most certain subject of study. You would have certain answers to questions. And of course, the longer I've lived in the law, the more I've appreciated the law in many respects doesn't lead to certain answers to questions at all.
And that will certainly have a big bearing on what we discuss a bit further on. So you found, in short, that it was more like shifting sands.
Yes, I'd say more like shifting sands, although that probably exaggerates it a bit. But there are distinct areas of uncertainty about the law, and that can't be avoided. It's unavoidable.
Did you come to terms with that fairly quickly when you realised it wasn't about certainty at all?
I think so. Yes, I think so.
So what were the formative experiences that led you to become comfortable with that? Was it during wartime, for example, where you saw how things operated that might have led to a more realistic appraisal, if you like, of what you were going to be doing?
I think so. Certainly, the period I spent in the Air Force did have a very strong impact on me, and I think it made me much more of a realist than I had been before.
Do you think in a way that could be lacking or said to be lacking in today's training of young lawyers, barristers? It's not everyone that gets the opportunity to be dealing with a war situation, I suppose, where you have to make much more instantaneous decisions.
Yes, I agree with that, but I think the answer is a more generalised answer than your specific question would warrant. I think you can see it in other walks of life. Take politicians, for example. The comment was only made the other day that so many of our politicians follow a very narrow career path. You know, they join the party, they do things in the party they're expected to do, they become a politician or ministerial assistant. What experience do they have of the world outside? Now, in the same way, you can ask the same sort of questions, pose the same sort of questions about lawyers. They follow a career path, they've got their nose to the grindstone. What extracurricular experience, apart from social experience, do they really have?
So it was a good thing in a way to go through a war experience.
I agree entirely.
Because in other words, perhaps if things had been different, the times had been different, you would have gone straight into a career in law and may not indeed have been exposed to the sorts of things you were.
Although I don't think a career in law at that time was as high pressure concentrated as a career in law is today. The competition is much more ferocious today than it was in my day. I remember somebody who went to school with me who managed to get into medicine with, I think, 3 Bs and a lower, which is just about the lowest pass you could get. And if I remember rightly, he won the University Medal in Medicine.
Well, marks aren't everything anyway, are they? Because that by no means tells a person whether they're going to be actually proficient in what they do later on.
No, and it doesn't always give you a reliable indication of the marks that you'll get at the university when you leave school anyhow.
So how were those university years for you as a result?
Well, I enjoyed the university years very much. Mind you, I did the 4-year law course in 3 years. Therefore I met a larger range of students because I was moving through 2 years actually in the space of the 3 years, and I therefore became acquainted and friendly with a larger number of students than otherwise I would have done had I done a regular 4-year course. And again, the ability to do a 4-year course in 3 years was one that was extended to ex-servicemen, not to other people.
There were sort of interesting times for returned servicemen, especially those who were aspiring to a career at the bar. And yes, I believe there were those accelerated courses. And
yes, they called them an accelerated course. That was the adjective they used.
Yes.
Did they do the same thing in Melbourne?
Yes, that's right. So, and I was thinking, in fact, of one of the people I did interview who spoke about that too, Philip Opas.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, so it is interesting. In those days, of course, there were only a few hundred at the bar. But when I was interviewing Nerida Cohen's son, apparently she didn't come back to the bar. Her career at the bar ended during the 40s, and there was some feeling she had apparently about not wanting to have chambers when there were all these returned servicemen who wanted to come back and go into practice.
Yes, I can follow that. Because there was a big shortage of chambers, I think both in Sydney and Melbourne.
That's right. I just wanted to ask you just one more question about your time in the Australian Air Force. You attained the rank of flying officer, and I just wondered, did you meet or form any other friendships in that time that were to be in any way instrumental for your career later on?
No. I kept in touch with one or two of the people that I served with, but they had no impact at all on my career.
when I interviewed Tom Hughes, flying was clearly in his blood because his father had been
That's
also
right.
very...
In the First World War.
That's
He'd
right.
been a pilot in the First World War.
That's right.
Yeah.
Though he apparently didn't like the expression flying ace, which was an American expression. Did you hear that much of that term when you were there?
No. I think it was more an American term than an English term. But of course it was used by English newspapers and media people, although it didn't have the common acceptance that it had in the United States.